Today we're going to talk about the beginning of the Cold War. We'll spend the rest of the session talking about the Cold War. So if you'd like to follow along, this is the Cold War origins to 1960. Okay, so the American and the Russian soldiers meet. They invaded Germany from opposite sides. They meet in April of 1945. The two countries had been allies in the greatest war in human history. They should have been best friends maybe from this point on, but instead they turn into enemies. How does this happen? That's kind of what we're going to look at today. If you want a textbook definition of the Cold War, you can look at slide 4. Basically, the Cold War lasts from the end of World War II up until 1989, 1991. In 89, the Berlin Wall fell, and in 91, the Soviet Union collapsed. Some people argue that the Cold War has its origins in World War I. That's kind of a broader perspective. It's true, but we're kind of going to mostly focus on World War II until the end of the 1980s, early 1990s. So the Russian Revolution of 1917, that's kind of where the Soviet Union is born. There was a democratic revolution in February, March of 1917, but then in October, November of that same year, the Bolshevik or Communist Revolution occurred. That's when the Soviet Union becomes communist. Because the Soviet Union is communist and because they exited World War I, Russia is not at the Paris Peace Conference. Many of the Western leaders at the Paris Peace Conference at Versailles, they did not trust the Bolsheviks, the Russians, the communists. Winston Churchill famously said, "Kill the Bolshevik, kiss the Hun." Basically, what that means is the Bolsheviks, the Russians, are more dangerous now than the Germans had been. So there were some Western leaders that thought, we should ally ourselves with Germany. The Bolsheviks are now the new enemy. Also, during the Russian Civil War, which occurred after 1917, you had the whites versus the reds. The whites were anti-communist, the reds were the communists. Some of the allied countries, such as Britain, America, Japan, sent troops into Russia to try to help the whites win the Civil War. The reds end up winning the Civil War. This is one more reason why the Bolsheviks don't trust the West, just because they actually helped their enemies during the Russian Civil War. Eventually, Joseph Stalin succeeds Lenin in the 1920s. He kills off his competitors. He doesn't trust the West, partly because of that intervention in the Russian Civil War, and also the West, they're capitalistic. He doesn't trust them. There were some things during World War II that happened that kind of play a significant role in the Cold War later on. If you remember, Hitler and Stalin signed a non-aggression pact. Basically, Stalin did not trust the Western democracies to stand up to Hitler, so he felt like he had to take matters into his own hand. So Stalin already doesn't trust the Western countries prior to World War II. And then during World War II, Stalin does a couple things that really alienate the West and especially the people in Poland. During the war, there's a massacre of Polish army officers called the Battle of Katyn Forest. That was perpetuated by the Russian soldiers at Stalin's order. Also during the war, as the Russians were about to conquer Poland and defeat Hitler, the Red Army stopped outside of Warsaw and let the Nazi and the Polish liberators fight each other, and the Polish liberators get totally destroyed by the Nazis. Stalin could have helped them, but he didn't. He let the Nazis defeat them during this thing called the Warsaw Uprising. So there's a lot of bad blood between Stalin and the West. So fast forward to the end of the war, 1945. Nazi Germany is defeated, and America and the Soviet Union are about to become enemies. If you look at slide 13 and slide 14, you can kind of see how there are some similarities and some differences between the Soviet Union and the United States. Probably the biggest thing to remember is if you look at slide 15, think about their experiences in World War II. America fought a two-front war in Europe and the Pacific. They had up to 450,000 people killed, but there was no damage to the continental United States. America's factories, cities, transportation system, food supply, none of this was destroyed. America really came out of World War II stronger because of World War II. The total opposite is true of the Soviet Union. They had fought basically a one front war in Europe against Hitler. 27 million Russians were killed. For every one American killed, 90 Russians were killed. The Soviet Union's factories, cities, transportation system, food supply, all of this stuff is totally devastated. So Russia came out of World War II a very broken country. And if you think about it, America is a capitalist country, Soviet Union is communist, America is democratic, the Soviet Union is run by a dictatorship. Some historians argue that conflict was inevitable just because the two systems are so different. Um, if you would like to really explore the Cold War, I would suggest reading anything by John Lewis Gaddis. He's kind of the most famous American historian of the Cold War. I would start with either his The Cold War, A New History. That's kind of a general overview, or Strategies of Containment. That kind of talked about America's approach to the Cold War, but these are really good books to read. Okay, so after World War II is over, FDR dies. He actually dies during the war, and then Winston Churchill is going to get voted out of office later. So Stalin is kind of left as far as the big three. If you look at slide 19, you can kind of see what he wants for himself. This is according to John Lewis Gaddis's book. Basically, Stalin is a communist, but he's also a nationalist. He wants security for himself and his country. He puts that before spreading the communist ideology. He still wants to spread it. But Stalin had a lot going on after the war, but he puts the interests of the Soviet Union ahead of the interests of communism. And basically, there's a question: who should get what in the post-war world? How can you decide this question? Well, whoever's most powerful could decide who gets what. The United States and the Soviet Union are the most powerful. Who has the most influence? The Red Army controls all of Eastern Europe because they conquered it as they marched towards Germany. So they have a lot of influence. Who spent the most blood and treasure in World War II? Obviously, it's Russia, in Stalin's opinion. So basically, Stalin thinks Russia should have the biggest say in the post-war world, but precisely because they spent so much blood and treasure, their resources are drained, and they don't have as much say as maybe they would have wanted to. John Lewis Gaddis talks about 4 causes of the Cold War. You can read about them. I'll just mention them. But the Second Front and the Separate Peace, that's one of the causes. Spheres of influence, these are another one. How the Allies, America and Russia, dealt with their defeated enemies, that's another one. And then the atomic bomb. There's a lot of secrecy and mistrust around the atomic bomb. But basically, those are kind of 4 things that helped maybe lead to the Cold War. There's also some other events, such as what happens in Iran, Turkey, and the Mediterranean. Basically, Stalin wants to secure his southern border. He delays troop withdrawals from Iran. Iran had been occupied by a joint British and Soviet force. Basically, the two countries wanted to keep the oil out of Hitler's hands, so they occupied the country, and they agreed that they were going to leave when the war was over. But now the Soviet Union doesn't want to leave. Stalin demands territorial concessions from Turkey, and he wants control of the Turkish Straits. He wants access to the Mediterranean. He also demands some of Italy's colonies in North Africa. So Stalin has a lot of demands after the war. After the war, only those 2 countries, the United States and the Soviet Union, were great powers. FDR had wanted to maintain good relations with Stalin and the Soviet Union, but he also wanted to build a permanent Wilsonian-style peace based on collective security, self-determination, and free trade. That's going to mesh or not mesh well with Stalin. Stalin doesn't necessarily want those things. He wants security, but he's not going to trust others necessarily for that security. During the war, there were a number of conferences that took place that started to shape the post-war world. The Yalta Conference in February of 1945. This is in the Crimea. The big 3 meet. They know that Hitler's going to be defeated, so they start talking about how to reorganize the post-war Europe. They start talking about how to set up the United Nations. They talk about spheres of influence. They talk about having free elections in Eastern Europe. That's a big deal. Eastern Europe is a messy spot. Eastern Europe is in the Soviet sphere, but FDR and Churchill want free elections there. Stalin promises free elections, but it's an empty promise. He won't allow that to happen because he wants a buffer zone between Germany and the Soviet Union, and Eastern Europe is that buffer zone. So he wants governments friendly to him in case the Germans ever attack again. And it's not crazy to think that. You know, if you think about World War I and World War II, the Soviet Union had really been beaten and hurt very badly by Germany. So he's like, you're not going to get us a third time, Germany. Maxim Litvinov was a Soviet ambassador to the United States. He had some interesting things to say. He said the Soviet Union believed in the outmodeled concept of security in terms of territory. The more you've got, the safer you are. That's the ideological concept prevailing here, is that conflict between communist and capitalist worlds is inevitable. So basically, he admits that Stalin thinks territory will make him safe. So this takes place in Iran. Also, the pressure put on Turkey, and there's a communist group fighting a civil war in Greece. So basically, Greece goes through a civil war in the late 1940s, and on one side is communist and the other side is anti-communist. Later on in the war, there's something called the Potsdam Conference. Potsdam is like a suburb outside of Berlin. Basically, the big three. Truman at this point is there. FDR is dead. They agree to divide Germany up into 4 zones of occupation: a British, French, American, and Soviet sector. Truman learns about the testing of the A-bomb here, and he tells Stalin that he has a weapon that will end the war. And all Stalin says is, "I hope you use it." And Truman was kind of confused, like, hey, I just told you I have a secret weapon that's going to end the war. Why aren't you asking me more about it? It turns out Stalin had spies in the Manhattan Project, and he knew that the bomb was built even before Truman did, which is kind of nuts considering Truman's vice president and then president, but Stalin knew more about this because there's a lot of communist spying going on in America and England. We'll talk more about that later. The U.S. does stay engaged after the war. They take part in the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. They take place in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, kind of a free trade agreement, the Bretton Woods system. The United Nations gets founded in April of 1945. There's a Security Council with 5 permanent members: America, Great Britain, France, China, and the Soviet Union. There's 6 other nations on a rotating basis, and the 5 permanent members have a veto. That'll be important to remember later on, because we're kind of going to compare how did the United Nations succeed where the League of Nations failed. When Truman becomes president, he actually takes a tough stance towards Stalin and the Soviet Union. Some of his advisors thought that conflict was inevitable. Some historians think if FDR would have lived, maybe the Cold War would have been avoided, because FDR had kind of a way with people and he might have been able to work better with Stalin, whereas Truman was kind of inexperienced and real rough with the Russians. I don't know if that's true, but that's the theory. So some other events that kind of led to the Cold War happening. In February of 1946, Stalin gives a real famous speech where he basically says capitalism and imperialism make future wars inevitable. And America, Britain, the West, they're capitalist and imperialist in his views. So he says we're going to have a war someday with them. A lot of people in the West see this as a call to war. They're really worried. The Americans have a diplomat in Moscow named George F. Kennan. They ask him to write basically a policy paper like, what did you think about Stalin's speech? What does this mean? How should America deal with this future war that's inevitable in Stalin's eyes? What Kennan does is he writes something that's known as the Long Telegram. He basically calls the Soviet Union an Oriental despotism. He says their hostility to the West is what provides their dictatorship with the fuel that keeps it going. A year later, he writes an article in Foreign Affairs, and this is a really famous article. It's called the Sources of Soviet Conduct, I believe is the title. But it says the United States must meet the Soviets with unalterable counterforce at every point where they show signs of encroaching upon the interests of a peaceful and stable world. Kennan calls for a long-term, patient but firm, vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. That word containment basically becomes American policy for the next 50 years. The United States must contain Soviet aggression and expansion. Don't go to war with the Soviet Union, just contain their spreading. Um, Kennan believed that the Soviet system was so corrupt, communism was doomed to fail, and eventually the Soviet Union would collapse on its own. So containment, George Kennan, make sure you remember that. Later on in that year, in March of 1946, Winston Churchill goes to Fulton, Missouri, or Fulton College in Missouri, and he gives this famous speech known as the Iron Curtain speech. He basically says, "Look, the Soviets are cutting off Eastern Europe from Western Europe, and basically behind this Iron Curtain, you have totalitarianism. Things are not the way they used to be." But probably the biggest thing that kind of cemented the Cold War was what Truman did. In 1947, the British tell the U.S. that they're pulling out of Greece and Turkey, out of the Mediterranean. They can't stay there any longer. Britain was devastated by the war. Now remember, there's pressure being put on Turkey by Stalin. There's a communist civil war, a communist war in Greece going on. Basically, if the British pull out, the fear is that the communists will win everywhere in the Mediterranean. So what ends up happening is Truman decides that America should fill that void. And this is basically what kind of a lot of historians see as like the Cold War's starting point, I guess you could say. In March of 1947, he gives a speech to Congress. And he basically asks Congress for money to help nations who are fighting communism. He asked for $400 million to go to Greece and Turkey. And basically what Truman says is it's America's job to protect the world. And if we don't protect freedom around the world, who will? Nobody. And eventually, if we let the world collapse, that will be the end of us. This is called the Truman Doctrine, giving money to countries struggling against communism and supporting free people around the world who are resisting communism. You should watch this little clip. It's a clip of him talking, but you're going to read his Truman Doctrine speech. Basically, the Republicans don't want to do this yet. Republicans kind of want to go back to isolationism. Their leader in the Senate is Robert Taft of Ohio, the son of the former president. And they're not sure about this, but basically Truman says, look, if the world goes to hell in a handbasket because of communist aggression, and you didn't take steps to do anything about it, you'll be to blame. So basically, America becomes an interventionist country because of President Truman's policies. So that ends up happening. Another big thing is the Marshall Plan. George C. Marshall was Secretary of State. He was one of the head generals during World War II. He looks at Europe and sees that Europe is destroyed. So how can we help Europe? How can America help Europe? Well, the way we can help them is to stop the spread of communism by loaning and granting money to Europe to rebuild. Basically, communism spreads when hunger and poverty and despair are widespread. American economic assistance will reverse this. The Americans offer this aid to the Soviet Union, but they know the Soviets will not accept it and probably won't let any of their Eastern satellite nations accept it. And basically, the United States could seize the geopolitical moral initiative with this plan. So that's what happens. The United States announces, or rather George Marshall, while he's given a speech at Harvard in June of 1947, he says, we're going to give away a ton of money to rebuild Europe. Anybody can ask for this money. We'll have committees and we'll hand this money out. Congress waits about a year and then approves this plan, $13 billion in the first 4 years. Stalin does force his Eastern communist countries, his satellite nations, to refuse. A lot of them wanted the money, but he wouldn't let them have it. In February of 1948, Stalin forces the Czechoslovakians to give up this Marshall aid that they had accepted. And one of the most important political leaders in Czechoslovakia, named Jan Masaryk, his body is found below a window outside a hotel. Nobody knows if he was jumped or pushed, but after that happens, the communist forces take over in Czechoslovakia. So you have a communist coup in this country, and basically this worries the United States that communism is going to spread. Um, Berlin becomes a big deal here in a little bit. There's still no unification. Remember, the city's broken up into 4 zones. The British, the American, and the French want to consolidate their zones. They start to do that with a currency, um, but the Deutschmark. But Stalin doesn't want to do this, so Stalin cuts off the western part of Berlin from the rest of Europe. Remember, Berlin is within East Germany, which is communist. Um, West Berlin depends on 12,000 tons of supplies a day, coal and food. Stalin cuts off the electricity. So how are the Allies going to keep Berlin alive? That the main American there, General Lucius Clay, wants to run an armored convoy through Soviet territory and basically force them to stop the convoy. But the British come up with a better plan. Earlier during the war, the Russians had allowed 3 corridors, air corridors to Berlin from the west. So basically, the British decide, let's fly supplies in to Berlin and keep the city alive. So while the Berlin blockade is going on, you have the Berlin airlift. So basically, about a year, you have food, coal, other supplies flown into the city daily. It keeps the city alive. Americans counter blockade the Soviets. They cut off wheat, other food supplies. They cut off machine tools, steel, anything the Soviets need for their economy. And basically, this counter blockade hurts the Soviets more than the Soviet blockade hurts the Berliners. You need to watch the video there on the slide that shows the Berlin airlift. It's a newsreel. It really tells you how things happen. It's really good original footage. This turns out to be a huge publicity win for the Americans and the British and the French. Basically, what happens is Stalin cancels the Berlin blockade. He allows supplies to start coming through on the ground again. So the Americans and the British win the gratitude of all the Berliners. They gain the respect of a lot of Germans because they kept the city alive. So it's a global relations triumph that makes Stalin look kind of petty. A couple years later, you have the formation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. 12 nations form NATO, and the charter of NATO says an armed attack against one or more of them shall be considered an attack against all of them. So those 12 countries, if Russia attacks any of them, it's going to bring all of them into war. In 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany is created. This is West Germany. This is the anti-communist Germany. They joined NATO in 1955. In 1955, you end up having the formation of the Warsaw Pact. This is the military alliance of communist nations. The reason the Warsaw Pact is formed is because they're worried that West Germany is going to rearm. So you also have the creation of East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, the GDR. They're created in 1949. So basically, Europe is breaking down into 2 military camps, I guess you could say. So there's a lot of origins and causes of the Cold War. Later on in 1947, you have something called the National Security Act. This creates the Department of Defense, the CIA, the National Security Council. In April of 1950, the National Security Council delivers a report. It's known as NSC 68. It's a pretty famous report. Basically, what it says is America must maintain its nuclear edge, which means producing a hydrogen bomb, a bomb that's better than what the atomic bomb was. They also call for increasing taxation to create a bold and massive program of rebuilding the West's defensive potential and surpass the Soviet Union's. Truman, one of the important things he decides is that he wants to keep atomic weapons in civilian control. He doesn't want them to be like a tank or an airplane or a rifle, something the military guys can decide. He wants the president making the decision if they're going to be dropped. Okay, so basically we've kind of covered the origins of the Cold War up until 1949. It looks like the West is doing pretty good. But 1949, 1950 are seen as setbacks for the West. You've got 3 things happen in 1949, 1950, but we'll talk about them next time.